Therefore, the meditator who has reached the present ninth stage should note the state of the mind while practicing each of the preceding 8 stages. He has to begin anew from the very first stage and successively proceed to the 8th stage, noting in each the state of the mind. He will then see clearly how the state of the mind is while 1. Contemplating long breathing, 2. Contemplating short breathing, 3. Experiencing the whole body, 4. Calming the bodily formation, 5. Experiencing rapture, 6. Experiencing bliss, 7. Experiencing the mental formation, 8. Calming the mental formation, thus while noting the differences in states of mind in all corresponding stages. He comes to pierce through the mind as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and no self. Having gained the penetration of impermanence, etc., he rids himself of the perception of the mind as permanent, pleasurable, and as a self or entity. With the result that he becomes wearied and has no passion for the mind, he reaches cessation of the mind and finally renounces it. All this gradual practice is made possible by contemplating in a successively more subtle manner, by means of the 16 ways. At this point, to summarize the 16 ways, we can say that citta, in each stage, becomes manifest to the meditator when he contemplates by means of breathing in and out in 16 ways, that is, by experiencing the mind in 16 ways, namely, by way of knowing, contemplating, perceiving, clearly seeing, reflecting, deciding mentally, resolving with faith, exerting energy, establishing mindfulness, concentrating the mind, knowing clearly through wisdom, knowing thoroughly through the highest knowledge, apanaya apajanato, fully understanding, abandoning what should be abandoned, developing what should be developed, and finally realizing what should be realized. As the meditator practices in this manner, with his mind one-pointed
and not distracted in each phase of breathing in and out, the mind as a whole is clearly manifest to him as something compound, created, sakkata, and therefore impermanent, unsatisfactory, no self, etc. This is the explanation of experiencing the mind. Apart from the above explanation, we find in some places in the scriptures other ways of looking at the characteristics of the mind, e.g. See Anapanasati, Nikaya, that we can in addition take them into account as principles with which to understand the mind. They are to see whether 1. The mind is greedy or not greedy, 2. Hateful or not hateful, 3. Deluded or not deluded, 4. Contracted or scattered, 5. Developed or underdeveloped, 6. Surpassable or unsurpassable, 7. Concentrated or unconcentrated, 8. Liberated or unliberated. However, all this shows that, no matter in what state the mind is, it has the general characteristics of impermanence, etc. From whatever angle a state of the mind is viewed, it leads to exactly the same result. The third point, regarding knowledge, jnana, and mindfulness, sati, together with other dhammas developed as a result of practice, has the same explanation as in the previous stages, only the gist of it is given here, when the meditator contemplates or experiences the mind in each or any of the 16 ways. It is manifest clearly by means of breathing in and out. Mindfulness is established and eventually performs the function of insight knowledge, anapanasati. The meditator by means of that mindfulness and that knowledge experiences the mind through breathing in and out, in each of the 8 modes of each of the first 2 tetrads. See pages 451-2. In this way development of mindfulness reaches culmination and is called Anapanasati because it is development or bhavana, complete in all the 4 definitions or senses, in the sense that there is non-excess of the mental states arisen through 1. Satipana, establishment of mindfulness,
2. That the faculties, etc. function jointly to the same result. 3. That energy is in conformity with faculties and other dhammas. 4. That the mind enjoys, see pages 350 till 357. When the practice of Satipana Bhavana is thus full-fledged, there is the gathering together, samadhana, of the 29 dhammas. The 5 faculties, the 5 powers, 7 enlightenment factors, 8 links of the path, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and so on to emancipation, and nibbana, the deathless. Again, it is always understood that with the gathering together of different dhammas the meditator always knows the domain, gakara, and penetrates the benefit of calm, samatha, of those respective dhammas or groups of dhammas. In short, there arises mindfulness, performing the function of contemplation, and with it knowledge, arises. Development, bhavana, is at its height. 29 kinds of dhammas come together. The state of weariness, dispassion, cessation and renunciation in regard to the mind are manifest as in the case of rapture, etc. Thus is the coming into being of knowledge, mindfulness, etc. by the power of the present stage in which the meditator watches closely different kinds of mind as the object of his contemplation. He has insight into the fact that no matter how many different kinds of mind there are, all of them are equally subject to impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and no self. Now at this juncture we should observe the differences among the three tetrads by taking a bird's-eye view. When the three are compared, it can be seen clearly that the first tetrad deals with noting and controlling the breathing in various ways. The second tetrad deals with noting and controlling feeling in various ways. The third tetrad further deals with noting and controlling the mind in different ways. Here it should be kept in mind that the term noting in each case refers to actually seeing what characteristics the several objects of contemplation really have.
What they arise from, how they cease to be, and so forth. On the other hand, the term controlling implies calming down the objects in each case by making them successively more subtle, delicate and weaker, so that gradually they become powerless and eventually condition nothing, or by successively clinging less, and finally abandoning clinging, adana, to them altogether. All this is the main objective of practicing anapanasati kamana. In spite of all difficulties, one should persevere in this. To sum up, the meditator experiences the mind by means of mindfulness and knowledge, thoroughly examines all states of mind which are manifest in anapanasati, with the result that eventually he does not in any way conceive the mind as ego or self in any form, and is wearied and dispassionate with regard to clinging to it, regarding it as his ego or self, as he previously used to. Stage 10. The guideline for practicing the 10th stage of anapanasati reads, gladdening the mind, I shall breathe out, thus he trains himself. Gladdening the mind, I shall breathe in, thus he trains himself. Here the expression he trains himself follows the pattern of explanation as given in the preceding stage and elsewhere. The point to be discussed here is with regard to gladdening the mind. When does gladdening of the mind arise? What is gladdening of the mind like? The explanation is as follows. Precisely, gladdening of the mind which is wholesome through dhammas can be induced while practicing any of the stages of anapanasati. Therefore, the meditator undertaking the practice of the present stage has to strive to give rise to gladdening of the mind in each of the preceding stages. He has to go back and practice, beginning with the first stage onwards up to the 9th stage, all the time striving to gladden the mind until gladness becomes manifest clearly and becomes gradually more subtle in each successive step as follows.
1. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind by means of long in and out breathing, there arises gladdening of the mind. 2. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind by means of short in and out breathing, there arises gladdening of the mind. 3. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind by means of experiencing the whole body, there arises gladdening of the mind. 4. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind by means of calming the bodily formation, there arises gladdening of the mind. 5. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind while experiencing rapture, there arises gladdening of the mind. 6. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind while experiencing bliss, there arises gladdening of the mind. 7. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind by means of experiencing the mental formation, there arises gladdening of the mind. 8. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind while calming the mental formation, there arises gladdening of the mind. 9. While clearly knowing one-pointedness and non-distraction of mind while experiencing the mind, there arises gladdening of the mind. When the practice goes like this, it is called the practice of the 10th stage of anapanasati. The significance of this stage is not only to know how, but to be able to gladden the mind in each stage, and then to contemplate the very gladdening of the mind itself as an object that is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and no self. Gladdening of the mind can always be induced in many different ways, provided that ways and means which are its causes and conditions are developed. In the case of anapanasati, gladdening of the mind can be brought about in various ways in connection with the 9 stages as follows.
1 to 2. In the first 2 stages of anapanasati, gladness, or gladdening of the mind arises, primarily because of the feeling of satisfaction which results from practicing as such, or thought of having the chance to practice the way leading out of suffering propounded by the Buddha. Secondly, gladness arises because contemplation of both long and short breathing meets with success. 3. In the third stage there arises gladness which is more refined because the contemplation of the breathing becomes more subtle than before. At this time, the mental objects connected with the third stage, such as zeal, chanda, and the like, become more intensive, and therefore gladness becomes more refined. 4. In the fourth stage, the practice of contemplation advances to the extent that jhanas arise. With their arising, gladness becomes more delicate by experiencing happiness here and now, daya dhamma sukha vihara. 5. In the fifth stage, the meditator experiences piti, which is a definite factor of jhana and very close to gladness itself. Gladness is thus exclusively contemplated and seen more clearly than ever before. At this time, it comes to be more involved with wisdom or insight through penetrating different feelings as impermanent, etc. 6. In the sixth stage, gladness, or gladdening of the mind, has similar features to the fifth stage, but more refined, of course, because it is contemplated or experienced in the form of a jhanic factor, i.e. in the form of bliss. 7. In the seventh stage, gladness becomes proportionally more delicate owing to the higher development of insight, and various feelings are noted as mental conditions. When feelings are thus known, the meditator becomes aware how things condition craving, ta, clinging, upadana, etc. So much so that he now sees the way out of suffering more clearly, and hence gladness in proportion to the vividness of seeing the way. 8. In the eighth stage, the mind is fully gladdened,
and the meditator is able to calm the mental formation. Because of this ability, he has the certainty that the control of defilements is within his reach. 9. As for the ninth stage, gladness arises because the meditator understands clearly all about the mind by knowing how it comes to be, how it ceases to be, what it delights in, and so on, to the extent that he has the conviction, I can control the mind. Finally, in the 10th stage, all the foregoing kinds of gladness are seen and dealt with, being thus noted and contemplated. And thus the meditator comes to have an added kind of gladness, due to this sense of certainty. Now I am able to control the mind just as I wish in the way in which I am presently ably controlling the mind and inducing gladness in diversified forms at will, and with the widest scope. Thus his mind is accordingly joyful through this most embracing and most lofty of gladnesses. Now the point what gladness or gladdening of the mind is like can be discussed in 2 ways. What is its meaning? In how many ways does it arise? There are these synonyms of gladdening of the mind: satasa abhippamodo, rejoicing, cheerfulness, glee, elation of mind, satisfaction of mind. All of these terms help us to know the state of mind from different angles. Generally speaking, gladdening of the mind, like rapture, pity, and bliss, sukha, can be induced by sense pleasures, gehasita, kama, and also by renunciation of sense pleasures, nikamasita. But here it is connected with Dhamma, the renunciation of sense pleasure. One should observe that the single expression gladness or gladdening the mind is used in both the above cases, but its meanings in the 2 cases are as far apart as the earth and the sky. As to the point, in how many ways does gladdening of the mind arise which is connected with the Dhamma? It is clear from the method of anapanasati that it arises in 2 ways. It arises firstly in connection with tranquility, samatha, or concentration,
and secondly in connection with insight, knowledge, or wisdom. Gladdening of the mind in connection with concentration evidently implies rapture and happiness, which are factors of jhana, or the feeling of happiness, sukha, resulting from one-pointedness, ekagata, and non-distraction of the mind present in each stage. All this refers to happiness born of jhana. However, even the sense of gratification, strongly rising on account of succeeding in practice, is also reckoned as gladdening of the mind through concentration, because it is also rooted in concentration or tranquility. Gladdening the mind in connection with insight, knowledge, or wisdom is more subtle, more lofty, and of greater value. It arises when the meditator contemplates the gladness itself, which is a feeling of all conditioned things, sakara, and sees them as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and no self. The contemplation of impermanence, etc., gladdens the mind because the meditator knows that he has now gone deeply into the understanding of Dhammas. This is gladdening of the mind, which is purely on the level of Dhamma. To make it clear, let us, for instance, take rapture. Rapture, which is a factor of jhana, is reckoned as gladdening of the mind connected with tranquility, but when that rapture is, like all feelings, contemplated as impermanent, etc., there arises another of kind, rapture, which is rapture on a higher level of pure Dhamma, in connection with wisdom. So, there are two levels of rapture. To sum up, one kind of gladdening of mind arises at the time when the mind is endowed with tranquility of concentration, and another kind of gladdening arises when the mind is possessed of wisdom. These two kinds of gladdening the mind permeate, are involved in, or, as it were, exist simultaneously in each stage of anapanasati. In whatever aspect or at whatever time, the practice of anapanasati is dominated by concentration samadhi, gladdening of the mind in that respect is connected with that concentration.
On the other hand, in whatever aspect or whatever level the practice of anapanasati is dominated by wisdom, gladdening of the mind in that respect is connected with wisdom. In this way we can say that gladdening of the mind, which the meditator has been inducing in all the 9 stages and by virtue of which be now develops the 10th stage, refers to only these two kinds of gladdening of the mind already mentioned, that is, only these two kinds of gladdening, which are connected with renunciation, nekama, are meant here, and of the ones connected with worldliness, gehasita, or sensual pleasures, kama. Here is a point to be observed: the practice of this 10th stage is far greater fun than all the other stages. Why? Because, to put it in ordinary language, practicing this stage means amusing oneself. It is sporting in the exercise of meditation, enjoying now this and now that kind of happiness. Now in sport or at play with this object of contemplation, now with that, backward and forward, in and out, in endless ways he amuses himself. It is fun for the meditator, so to say. For this reason, the 10th stage is most distinguished. It stands out in the line of practice of anapanasati as a whole, even if one has reaped the fruit of one's practice of anapanasati only this much by being able to gladden the mind. We can say that one has attained to the gem of Dhamma, Dhammaratana. Point 1 is rich in gems of the Dhamma, knowing no limit. One should therefore, not only be highly interested in, but should also train oneself in, the practice of anapanasati. Finally, the last point to be considered, how knowledge, and mindfulness together with other dhammas come about, has in the main the same explanation as given in the previous stages.